Hi, everybody. Thank you very much for having me here today at the Global Sports Industry Conference. I hope everybody is looking forward to having an interesting conference today and learning a lot of things that perhaps we didn't know before. It's an honor and a privilege to be here to be giving the keynote address. I'm going to be talking about how technology is changing and potentially growing the sports industry. My goal is to give a bit of an overview. I can't possibly talk about everything specifically, so I'm going to throw a lot of things out there at once, and then hopefully we can get into some more details throughout the day. Before we get to that, I thought it would be a good idea to tell you a little bit about myself. I'm a journalist. I live in Toronto. I work mainly for the Globe and Mail, which is Canada's national newspaper, as well as the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, the CBC. Sometimes we refer to that as Canada's BBC because everybody knows what the BBC is, but nobody knows what CBC is. I also write a weekly technology column for the national newspaper in Abu Dhabi in the United Arab Emirates, and I've written 2 books, both of which are actually available here in South Korea. The latest is Humans 3.0, the upgrading of the species. And I bring this up not because I'm trying to do a cheap plug for my book, but because it does actually have some relevance to what we're going to be talking about today. And we'll get to that in a minute. As far as sports go, I wouldn't say I'm a huge sports fan. In fact, back in Canada, a lot of my friends, they say I'm anti-Canadian because I don't like hockey. I can't explain why I don't like hockey, but I've always actually preferred baseball. I'm actually pretty fanatical about baseball. I've loved baseball since I was a young child, and I've recently rediscovered it ever since my beloved Blue Jays started to finally win again, except, of course, this year, which is, of course, the first year in which I bought season tickets to the Blue Jays. Funny story about that is earlier this year, some of my wife's friends actually asked us, this was back in February, just after I had bought my season tickets, if we wanted to go with them on vacation to Tanzania to go on an African safari. And the only problem was they said that they were going in October last month. And of course, back in February, I said, there's no way we can go because the Blue Jays are going to be playing in the World Series. And that seems really funny in retrospect because they ended up finishing 1 game out of last place. So, joke's on me. Anyway, I have bought my season tickets again for next season. I hope the Blue Jays will do better because they obviously can't do much worse. Anyway, I'm Canadian, so one of the things you probably know about Canada right now is that our Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau, is quite popular. And it's not surprising, really. He's young, good-looking, and he's all those things that the guy who's leading the country south of us isn't, which is that he's a nice person. One other thing you might know about Prime Minister Trudeau is that he likes flashy socks. He like these Chewbacca socks that he's wearing here. He always wears colorful socks. So in honor of Mr. Trudeau and in honor of my hometown, I'm actually wearing my Blue Jays socks today. Okay, so before we get to sports and technology, I think we need to set the table a little bit, take a broad look at what's going on in the world. And the sports industry is actually in a very good position, I believe, today because of the larger global context in which it operates. So the theme of my book, Humans 3.0, is that the world is actually in better shape today in many ways than it ever has been. And I know that's a very surprising statement given some of what's happening in the world today, currently. But if you look at the data, in a lot of ways, this really is the best time ever to be alive. 2 of the biggest reasons for that, and this applies to the sports industry as well, is the global economy and the global health situation. So I want to talk about a little bit about the global economy first, because there's a lot of good news here. So way back in the year 0, or almost 2018 years ago, economists estimate that the global economy was worth about 102 billion international dollars. That's the fictional currency that they use to make such comparisons. As you can see from the chart, by the end of the 19th century, that had grown to $1.1 trillion, an increase of almost 1,000%. By the 20th century, the end of the 20th century, it was $33 trillion, another 3,000% increase. By 2013, it was $70 trillion, another doubling. And then by 2030, about 12 years from now, it's expected to once again double to $143 trillion. So there is no end in sight to this astronomical economic growth. And as we see over the relatively recent time period, it's accelerating quite quickly. Now, what this actually means in real terms is that the world is coming out of poverty at an incredible rate. The proportion of people who are living in extreme poverty in the world fell by half between 1990 and 2010, according to the United Nations. That's 20 years, only 20 years, in which the number of people who are extremely poor was cut in half, which I think is pretty incredible. Much of this happened in China and in India, but the effects have been felt outside of Asia as well. Outside of Asia, the poverty rate actually fell from 41% in 1981 to 25% in 2008. So this amazing growth is resulting in some of our leaders having some pretty bold predictions. Nobel Prize-winning economist Edward Prescott says the whole world is going to be rich by the end of this century. This guy you might recognize, Microsoft founder Bill Gates, he says by 2035 there will be almost no poor countries left in the world. That's a pretty aggressive estimate because 2035 is really not that far away. Now, no one should be under the impression that this is all happening easily or smoothly. You just have to look around at the world and see what's happening right now to see that this is happening unevenly. And I think many of the problems that we have in the world today can be traced back to inequality, economic inequality, which is on the rise almost everywhere as a result. Much of the division that we're seeing in places like the United States, the UK, and in Europe is the result of this rising inequality. So the challenge of our time, I think, is to resolve this inequality, preferably quickly and hopefully peacefully. The only consolation is that this isn't something that has never happened before. This is actually a cycle that often recurs. And the last one we had was roughly about a century ago. And it resolved itself in good ways and bad. We had the Great Depression followed by a series of devastating conflicts, all of which was unbelievably terrible. On the upside, though, we did learn a lot from those situations, from those tragedies, and many countries actually emerged socially transformed for the better. Unemployment insurance, student loans, civil rights, more gender equality, all of these came about as responses to the effects of the previous cycle of inequality. And a lot of the prosperity that we've enjoyed over the past century, as we saw in the earlier slide, is actually a direct result of those changes. So we do need to do our utmost to ensure that we can somehow try to get through this current cycle without resorting to the destruction that we've seen in the previous cycles. I'm hopeful that we can do it. And that notwithstanding, I think, again, we have to consider the overall course of history. And in the world's economic direction continues to point upward, and that's a good thing, I think. Now, I mentioned the other strong factor, the strong positive factor for the future of the sports industry is the global health situation. And just as with the economic situation, overall health trends are also very positive. On a very basic level, life expectancy is up dramatically over time. 200 years ago, the average American could expect to live to about 39 years old. Today, it's double that, it's about 78. And that's the same in most developed countries, including here in South Korea, where people are living longer than Americans. And life expectancy is not just increase is not just happening in advanced countries, it's also happening very quickly in developing countries. And that's mostly because infant mortality is dropping quickly. In some African countries, as a matter of fact, infant mortality is falling by as much as 8% per year, which is pretty amazing. So what you're seeing is that the life expectancy gap between rich and poor countries is dropping quickly. In 1950, in advanced countries, the life expectancy gap between advanced countries and developing countries was 22 years. Currently, that gap is now shrunk to about half of that, 11 years. This isn't just because infant mortality is the infant mortality is decreasing. It's also obviously because people are living longer, and a big reason for that is the things that kill us are changing. So in 1900, over a century ago, the top 3 killers of Americans were pneumonia, tuberculosis, gastrointestinal infections. Today, the top 3 are heart disease, cancer, non-infectious lung disease. The big difference between these two is today, the top killers are non-infectious. They're environmental, self-inflicted, or genetic. In other words, they're more treatable or even preventable. This is why life expectancy is continuing to go up no matter where you live in the world. The United Nations actually expects this increase to go on without any upper limit. As you can see, this is from a study the UN did a little while ago. And this is actually, I think, a conservative estimate because it only takes into account natural progression. It doesn't take account the numerous scientific and technological developments or efforts that are underway that are specifically aimed at extending life expectancy. You have to assume that some of those are going to bear fruit, or at least we should hope that they do. So just as with the economy, this isn't happening without a downside. As I'm sure everybody knows, obesity is also on the rise in many countries. We're ironically going from a population that eats too little to a population that eats too much. Now, obesity is, of course, not just an issue about eating. It's also an issue that comes into play when it comes to exercise and sports. And it's also about inactivity. Many of us are unfortunately living sedentary lifestyles where we sit behind desks and behind computers. And also a lot of us, I can't talk about technology without also bringing up one of the negatives of it, in that it does tend to sometimes make us lazier. I know it does for me. Technology has definitely made me lazy in a lot of situations. I don't know how many people have robot vacuum cleaners. I have 2. And I thought that they would make my house cleaner, they would make my life easier, but in fact they've made me lazier because I can't even be bothered to push that button to make it go. So this is one of the downsides of technology. We have to be careful with it, that it doesn't actually increase our laziness. Okay, so let's put all of that together. An improving economic situation across much of the world means a number of things. It means that when people have an easier time providing the basics for their families, they have more time and resources for leisure activities. That can result in a lot of things. It means you can read more books, so you can watch more TV shows, you can watch more movies, you can go to concerts, and so on. It also means you have more time to watch, play, and otherwise engage in sports. More prosperity, therefore, means a larger sports market. And that's good news, I think, for everyone here today. Longer lives and better health are also big positives for the sports industry because they also mean people have a greater ability to partake in sports and for a greater portion of their lives. Now, even obesity can be seen as a positive because, as we know, the best cure for obesity is often exercise. And cynics may disagree with me on this point, but I think people are starting to understand this. Even Americans who live in what is classified the most obese developed nation in the world, according to the OECD, seem to be understanding this. If you look here, daily participation rates in exercise and sports are actually going up in the United States. About 20% of Americans today participate in some form of daily exercise, and that's up from about 16% in 2003. 20% is still pretty low, but the important thing here is that it's growing, and it's a start. Also encouraging is the fact that participation in the US in almost every sports category has been going up over the past 5 years. So the good news or the takeaway here is that sports participation is very closely linked to sports spectating, and those two are actually symbiotic. To give you a really good example, I'll bring up once again my beloved Blue Jays. This was a team that was miserable for the longest time. We won the World Series in 1992 and 1993, and then for 22 years, which I think is a record, they did not make the playoffs until that miraculous year 2015, 2 years ago, when they finally made it back to the playoffs. Now, you have to look at what's happened to baseball in Canada since then. Last year, there were more than 120,000 people playing baseball in Canada, which is an increase of 14% over the year before. A 14% increase in 1 year is pretty incredible, and I think that speaks to the proof of what happens when you have successful sports in a country that inevitably leads to more participation in those sports. So I think what we're seeing now is we're seeing a number of big sports leagues trying to expand globally. You have, especially in the US, you have the National Football League and the National Basketball Association making some inroads into Asia. So I think the outcome is pretty easy to predict. More people are going to play sports because more people are going to watch sports, and vice versa. So as a result, in North America, you have steady growth over the next few years predicted for the sports industry, from $64 billion in 2015 to $75 billion in 2020. I think the more interesting forecast, though, is in China, where the sports industry is expected to not just grow, but I would classify this as an explosion. That's more of a tripling of its value over the next few years. And if we use China as a proxy for the developing world, you can see how much the sports market is going to grow as the world becomes more prosperous. So again, to summarize, I think as this all shows, it doesn't matter where you are or where you live, the future market opportunity for sports is looking very, very good. So that brings us to technology. Now, it's worth noting that many of the economic advances that we've talked about, as well as the health advances, are actually due to technology. Technology has been a very big motivator and enabler of all of that growth. Developments in transportation and communications technology over the centuries have particularly been instrumental in opening up new markets and globalizing the world. Meanwhile, scientific breakthroughs in medicine, as well as food and sanitation technologies, have greatly helped us live longer and more healthier lives. I go into these subjects in my book in quite a bit. So if you're interested, I recommend reading it, and that is my cheap plug. But for right now, I'd like to get into some of the more current technologies that are going to change and expand sports. And I think here we have to start with streaming. Because this is the technology area I think that is going to have the biggest impact on how people watch sports over the next few years. As I said earlier, a lot more people are going to watch sports soon thanks to streaming, and as we know, watching is closely tied to participating. What's notable here is that the big American technology companies, Google, Amazon, Facebook, and Twitter, as well as a few Chinese companies like Tencent and Alibaba, they're coming at the sports market in a big way. So if you just take a look at some of these deals, these are, I believe, over the last 2 years. These are some of the deals that some of these companies have signed for sports rights. So the number of these deals is increasing, but also interesting is the value of the deals is increasing. So a great example is Twitter. Last year, they acquired the rights to Thursday night National Football League games. There was 10 games Thursday nights. The company paid $10 million for those rights. This year, Amazon bought the same rights for $50 million. So Amazon basically paid 5 times more than what Twitter did a year earlier. There's a couple of reasons why this is happening, but the biggest is advertising. Now, Google and Facebook in particular have done an excellent job in capturing the lion's share of the digital advertising market. In the United States, they have approximately 63% of the market between them. Globally, the digital ad market is worth about $533 billion, and these two companies have about 20% of that, which is really staggering when you think about it, about such a large market that two companies have such a large chunk of it. So this is why they don't have a lot more room to grow, especially in North America. In North America, these two companies can't really take more of that market without increasing the danger of government and regulators getting involved and starting to talk about things like duopoly. This is already starting to happen, actually. So they're looking at new markets, and sports is one of those. The global sports advertising market is estimated at about $532 billion, which is about the same size as the digital ad market. So at least one expert expects this to happen. Dennis Denninger, he's a professor at Syracuse University, he's a former producer for ESPN. He believes that either Google or Amazon is going to become the major rights holder of one of the big sports in the US. So in other words, rather than a traditional network like CBS or Fox having the full rights to football, basketball, or hockey, it's going to be one of these technology giants. Now, that doesn't mean that we're not going to be able to watch sports on traditional TV, but it does mean that we're also going to be able to watch them on YouTube, Twitter, Facebook, Amazon, and so on. These are global platforms, and they're available to anyone with an internet connection. And because these companies are primarily interested in the advertising dollars, I think that they're going to make these games viewable for free. That's what they've been doing so far. So it's hard to understate how big of a shift this is going to be. Live sports available to pretty much anyone in the world for free. The sports industry, I think, is going to change dramatically because of this over the next decade. And this is likely going to be bad news for the status quo, but I think it's going to be an overall plus for the industry because the exposure of sports is going to explode in size and reach. And just as a side note, Google and Facebook and Amazon, these are companies that have disrupted pretty much every industry that they've gone into. And now these companies are so huge that they're serious contenders in whatever market they decide to get into. Okay, so we're going to move on from streaming. Probably the hottest trend in technology today is artificial intelligence, so we have to talk about that for a bit. But one quick note before we get into it is when you speak to academics and scientists who work in this field, a lot of them really don't like the term artificial intelligence or AI because of the images it conjures. And especially in the West, when you mention artificial intelligence or AI, this is usually what you think of. Which is unfortunate because the AI that we're currently dealing with is closer to this. Many scientists prefer to talk about it as machine learning, and I have to agree that this is a better term for what's happening right now. This is basically where a computer can learn from existing data and suggest a course of action, which is a far cry from the Terminator. Machine learning, or if you really insist, we can call it AI, is currently infusing almost every industry that you can think of, from banking and law to shopping and even photography. And it's happening because three things have come together. The first is you have really powerful computers, not just individual computers, but networked computers that can draw on each other's power. So the ability to crunch data now is astronomical. You also have better algorithms. These are the rules and the training, or sort of the rules under which computers work with. And these are naturally created by humans. And humans have actually got pretty good at writing those algorithms. Now, computers can be really powerful and they can have really good rules to work with, but they're only as good as the data that they're trained on. And this is the third pillar of what's happening here, we are producing incredible amounts of data now for these computers to train themselves on. So the result is that you have computers that can now quickly learn tasks and deliver actually useful results or suggestions. And as I said, the results are being felt in every industry, and this includes sports. Here's a good example of how sports is being applied, of how AI is being applied to sports. Okay, so I don't know if it's obvious how machine learning was used in that clip. That was basically highlights. Those are highlights from this year's US Open. And they weren't actually compiled by a person, they were actually compiled by a computer. In fact, it was compiled by IBM's Watson. You might remember Watson as the computer that defeated some humans in the TV show Jeopardy a few years ago. Since then, IBM has been using Watson in some pretty useful ways. It's helping doctors and lawyers to, get their to work on their case files or for their diagnoses and so on. And obviously, it's also helping people compile sports highlights. How it works is actually pretty interesting. Basically, IBM's scientists they used Watson to rank about 26,000 match points at the US Open. And it was creating highlight videos within 2 minutes of the match ending. And then it was pushing those highlights to fans' phones, and fans could watch those highlights within minutes of the match ending. And how they did this was they trained Watson by teaching it how to recognize certain camera angles, crowd noise, excitement from the commentators' voices. They even taught it to see the fist pumps that the players would do. And then they fed it all sorts of older tennis footage, so they got a system that could reliably identify the highlights and put them together. So you can imagine that doing that is something that would take a human many hours to do. So the benefit to those human editors is that they're now freed up to do something more creative or more worthwhile. The Watson is basically doing the grunt work of sifting through all of that footage just to find the interesting parts. One further note on IBM and Watson, just last week they announced a partnership with ESPN where they're now applying Watson's machine learning to fantasy football pools. So if you are in one of those pools, you can now basically have a robot that tells you, that will look at, analyze players, analyze their previous histories. It can look at the upcoming matches, what stadiums they're playing in, and so on, and give you a relatively accurate prediction as to how that player is going to do, and then you can decide whether you should keep that player in your pool or put them on the bench for the week. I don't know how well it's going to work, but we're going to see. We're going to see, obviously. Another example of AI being used in sports. This is in a very different way. This comes from Microsoft, which recently announced something it's calling the Sports Performance Platform. So this is a system that takes data from a number of sources, including the wearable physical trackers that track athlete performance and so on. And it collects all of that data and adds up all that data, and then the machine learning takes over and studies the data to try to give you useful advice. So the idea here is it can study an athlete's hydration level, to how much sleep they get, and predict when they might get injured, so that it can tell coaches and athletes, hey, this person should be drinking more water, or this person should maybe not be doing as many sprints, and so on. So what it's trying to do is it's trying to deliver on the early promise of wearables. A few years ago, everybody went out and bought Fitbits. I don't know how many people own Fitbits or smartwatches and so on, but the trend kind of fizzled because a lot of these things would just track your data, and then that was it. It wouldn't really tell you what to do with that data. So this is another situation where somebody is trying to create something useful out of that data, and I think we're going to see a lot more of this. A number of leagues and a number of teams have already adopted Microsoft's platform. That includes Cricket Australia, Benfica, and Seattle Reign Football Club. So I think we're going to see a lot more of that sort of thing. We have to also talk about virtual reality. It is another one of these hotter technologies out there right now. I'm not going to talk about it too much, though, because one of our sessions this afternoon is going to go into further depth on that, I think. There's a few things I do have to talk about, though. For the most part, we've seen virtual reality used in video games and entertainment, but according to some of the sales numbers and the usage numbers, it doesn't appear to be really taking off there as many had hoped or expected. And I think there's a few reasons for this. The technology itself, with the higher end systems, they're still quite expensive. You do need computers that are very powerful, so those are expensive as well. So the cost is twice, it's expensive on 2 different levels. And also, making it or using it makes some people queasy. My wife uses virtual reality, and she sometimes gets queasy from it. I've actually done it myself and almost vomited, so I think there's still some work to be done there. My personal opinion, too, is that I also just don't think, I think the headsets are still too bulky. I don't think people want to wear these things on their faces for extended periods of time. And the other problem with virtual reality is you often look really silly when you're doing it. That said, virtual reality does have a lot of industrial, enterprise, and medical applications where the benefits of the technology outweigh those negatives. And I think in sports is actually one of them. One interesting application that we're seeing is concussion detection. So in the United States, in Iowa State University, there's a VR company called SyncThink, and Iowa State University is using their headset, which is called iSync VR. They're using it to track players' eyes to see if their brains are working correctly after post-concussion. I think this is interesting because it's not necessarily giving the players a virtual experience. I think that's technically optional, but they're using the same technology to actually assess their health, which is a novel way of using this technology. So I think we're going to see a little bit more of this sort of thing. Now, there's another more direct use of virtual reality.
This is gun trips left, 22 Mike, F Hunt, X Dog wide.
Did you have to memorize all these? Hey, I'm Kurt Wagner with Recode. We are here right in the heart of Silicon Valley. We're a short drive from Stanford and Facebook and Google. We found a much smaller startup. It's called Striver, and they train athletes, both college and pro, using virtual reality. They can actually put themselves in the game without taking the physical punishment. Let's check it out.
Football, American football is the core. We've seen guys that couldn't practice because of injury. Can I come into VR, put the headset on? I actually can go through my footwork at 10% speed and really get that, 1/10 of the physical rep, but 100% of the mental rep. That mental edge is oftentimes, what separates the pros from the Joes.
We are with Kevin Hogan, former Stanford quarterback, Rose Bowl champ.
Much of the quarterback's job happens before the ball is even in play.
Gotcha.
And that's something that a lot of people don't really realize.
Which is why this helps.
Was
this filmed when you were the quarterback? Like, are these your guys right here?
Yeah, these are some of my guys. I wasn't the quarterback in this particular rep.
Yeah, that doesn't look like you. I feel incredibly tiny. Actually, this guy looks a little bit smaller than me. I'm snapping. I'm looking to my far left. That guy slides over. Right there. Boom. Boom. There was number 4 way over there. And there was my running back covered. So I made the right choice. So you guys don't just work with people like Kevin.
Yeah, so we built a virtual hockey goalie simulator.
Now, do any actual pro goalies use this bad boy, or is it
No,
just
this is
for
more
fun?
of a fan-facing initiative, but now you can look up on the Jumbotron, wave your arms around, squat up and down. That's you.
What's up? Here comes the guy.
Now, the cool thing about this, Kurt, is you're actually seeing real video of real hockey players.
Oh my God.
So these are not video game graphics shooting at you.
So this is real?
It's real.
Like these are like coming right at my throat. Oh my gosh.
That was close.
I like that one. That one was fun.
It's neat. It's really, really fun.
It's actually got me.
Oh yeah, you get into it. A lot of people say it's the best VR they've ever seen.
Yeah.
Not necessarily because we have the most amazing graphics on demand. They're really good, but again, like ergonomically, you're doing something real. It's not kind of a made-up experience, right? So that it has a very, very strong impact on people.
That's saved.
That's a wrap. Thanks for hanging.
Okay, so as we can see there, this company, Striver, they're using VR to help train football quarterbacks and potentially hockey goalies down the road on how to do their jobs better. One thing that wasn't mentioned in that video is this is a useful tool for athletes to recover from injuries. Again, going back to concussions. In a lot of cases when athletes have injuries, you hear them talk about how it's not necessarily the physical problem or the physical part of the game that they have to get back into. It's the mental part as well. And this is a technology, again, because it is virtual, it allows them to experience or to start rehabbing or retraining again sooner, at least on a mental level, even if they can't go physically. So that's kind of an interesting development there. So again, this is, again, another technology where I think we're going to see more applications of it in sports, especially in sports recovery from injuries and that sort of thing. So I won't say any more about VR because we're going to hear a lot more about that this afternoon, I hope. One last technology that I do want to touch on before we wrap things up is augmented reality, sort of really related to virtual reality. In a nutshell, AR combines a camera and a screen of some sort to project interactive computer graphics or images onto what is otherwise the real world. The biggest AR success we've seen so far was Pokemon Go last year. This was, of course, the mobile phone sensation. It was a game that let you catch virtual monsters on your phone. These monsters were hiding in the real world. It grossed more than $1 billion for its creator, Niantic Labs. So this is why a lot of analysts are predicting that AR is going to be bigger than VR. Worldwide revenues for both are expected to increase by more than 100% for at least each of the next 4 years, from 11 billion this year to 215 billion in 2021. And about 80% of that is expected to be AR, VR making up the remaining 20%. The reasoning for this is simple. As Pokemon Go showed, the only hardware you need for augmented reality is a phone, which almost everybody already has. And most importantly, you don't have to wear anything on your face. Although that's actually not stopping some companies from developing AR headsets like Microsoft with HoloLens. Apple is also reportedly working on a headset. And of course, we've seen some other attempts there. My personal opinion is that just like with VR, these augmented reality headsets are going to have more niche applications. And I think sports is actually going to be one of those valuable niches because it actually makes a lot of sense. When you're playing sports or when you're engaging a lot of sports, you need to have your hands free, in which case a headset can be really handy. So in that vein, there's at least one very cool application that we're seeing. This is in golf from a German company called Viewlicity. Their product is called PuttView, and it's used in conjunction with Microsoft's HoloLens. And as you can see, it's pretty clear. You wear this thing, and when you're putting, and it can give you things like range and all sorts of interesting data about what you're trying to do, trying to get the ball in the hole. The possibilities for AR with consumers, I think, are also going to be pretty exciting. As a baseball fan and as a technology geek, I can't wait to use Major League Baseball's augmented reality app that's coming out, apparently coming out next season. So this is a stat geek's greatest dream come true because you can hold your phone up to the field and you can see all sorts of interesting information about the players and what's going on with the game. It's going to display in real time how hard a ball was hit, what speed pitchers are throwing at, how fast the runners are running, if they're breaking any records, and so on and so on. I already watch baseball games with my phone in one hand so that I can quickly look up statistics. So this is going to be really exciting for me, and I suppose it's going to be really exciting for a lot of people too. The only limitation to augmented reality, I think, is that it's not going to be able to explain to me why the Blue Jays are so terrible. That's unfortunately just real reality. Okay, so I think we've covered a lot of ground there over the last 30 minutes, and I hope that at least some of what I talked about was interesting and that everyone learned something that they didn't know. When I give these talks, I try to convey a sense of positivity and optimism largely because we journalists have a tendency to only focus on the negative, the bad news, and what's going wrong in the world. And that's important, of course, because that, uncovering those negative things is what helps society function properly. But in this day and age, there's so much media out there, and so much of it is negative, and you add in social media. I think it's important to counterbalance that with some of the positives and some of the good things that are happening too. And I think this actually meshes well with the whole purpose of sports. No one plays sports or watches sports because they hate them. We exercise and we play sports to become healthier and more fit and to build relationships with our friends and teammates, and also because it's a lot of fun. We watch sports for similar reasons, because we build bonds with our friends, our cities, even our countries, and also, of course, because it is often thrilling and fun. It can also be disappointing and painful, but I think that actually helps us to accept and deal with defeat, and it makes us better people in the end. So that's the message I'd like to close with today, is that the future looks good for both sports and the sports industry. It's set to grow, and I think technology is going to help it do so in many ways, which means it's going to help us watch and to participate. So in the end, it's going to improve our enjoyment of one of the most enjoyable things that we have today. Thank you very much, and I look forward to taking some of your questions.